behind schedule. Thank you for joining us. We have an excellent panel of cyber experts assembled here to illuminate a number of important policy and legal problems. First, we'll hear from former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, currently a partner at the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. Mr. Mukasey served as Attorney General of the United States from 2007 through 2009, previously served as a district judge in the Southern District of New York, rising to the level of Chief Judge in 2000. Next, we'll hear from Stuart Baker, a partner at the Washington office of Steptoe & Johnson. He previously served as the first Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and previously served at the National Security Agency as well. He is the author of Skating on Stilts, Why We're Not Stopping Tomorrow's Terrorism Today. I think I've got that right. You can find it on Amazon, so. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Steve Chabinsky, who's the Chief Risk Officer and Senior Vice President of Legal Affairs for Cybersecurity and Technology at the firm CrowdStrike. Also, point of personal interest, he's a fellow graduate of Duke Law School, fine institution. Finally, we'll hear from Jeremy Rabkin, George Mason's own. He's a professor here at the law school. Previously was a professor of government at Cornell University for 27 years, and recently was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to the Board of Directors of the United States Institute of Peace. So please join me in welcoming our panel. And first, we'll hear from General Mukasey. The floor is yours, sir.
Real general. I want to thank Rachel and the organizers of this conference. Microphone's on.
Check, check.
I guess the microphone understands that I was never meant to be a crooner. I was starting by saying that I wanted to thank Rachel and the Economic Warfare Institute, the ACD, for organizing this conference. I've already learned a great deal, as I'm sure you have. And I should also say that I drafted these remarks before I was aware that Chairman Rogers would be speaking to us and so on. Although this is a somewhat downbeat presentation, I would say that after hearing him in a somewhat more upbeat mood. This is probably about the 5th or 6th conference of this sort that I've been to since I left office, devoted to analyzing cyber threats and the strategies for meeting them. I've attended either as a participant or as a spectator. Of course, that doesn't include at least 2 that I attended while I was Attorney General, or the many meetings that I attended that were addressed to this problem in what seems to be the bygone days of 2007 to 2009. Now, of course, we've had successes in cracking this or that cyber attack, some launched domestically, some originated abroad, and even arresting some perpetrators, usually very youthful perpetrators, usually people from behind what was formerly the Iron Curtain, and is now a place where people have a lot of spare time. We've cooperated across national boundaries through the G8 High-Tech Crime Group, which includes more than 50 countries, perhaps even more remarkably, across bureaucratic boundaries within our own government. There's been cooperation between the public and private sectors through a cyber fusion center in Pennsylvania that brings together private parties and government investigators to collaborate in solving breaches and detecting cyber threats. But I think it's also fair to say that from a large macro standpoint, we're really not much nearer to solving this problem of unauthorized entry into and use of our computer systems than we were 5 years ago when I first started becoming acquainted with this. Now, that's not to say that there's necessarily a comprehensive approach that would work. Comprehensive being one of those words that often makes me wish I didn't live in a state with restricted gun laws. After all, we haven't come up with a comprehensive approach to crime, and that's been with us since the Garden of Eden. But at least we have laws against crimes, and at least a comprehensible, if not a comprehensive way of applying them. We really don't have that in the cybersphere. That's not to say we've been short on pronouncements. Back in May of 2011, the White House issued a 25-page document entitled International Strategy for Cyberspace, subtitled Prosperity, Security, and Openness in a network world. I've always thought that perhaps a further subtitle to that document after prosperity, security, and openness might be pick 2 out of the 3. so long as the 2 you pick aren't security and openness. The document, although it's entitled a strategy, really doesn't purport to lay out ways of achieving the desirable outcomes that its title suggests. For example, of the 25 pages in the document, a page and a half are devoted to defense, which is said to consist of dissuading and deterring. Dissuading, according to this document, is achieved by developing strength at home and strength abroad. Deterrence by holding out to criminals the prospect of investigation, apprehension, and prosecution. And to larger scale hostile actors in cyberspace, the promise that, quote, when warranted, the United States will respond to hostile acts in cyberspace as we would to any other threat to our country, unquote. The document then goes on to list the means by which we will respond: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, with the assurance that all options will be exhausted before resort to military, that the costs of inaction will be weighed against the costs of action, and that when we do act, it will be in a way that, quote, reflects our values and strengthens our legitimacy, seeking broad international support whenever possible. Now, I'm sorry, that's not the kind of thing that is going to make either Ahmadinejad or our friend in North Korea lose any sleep. It seems to me small wonder that after that document was issued in May of 2011, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta received a letter in July of 2011, signed by both the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, reminding him of his obligation under existing law to address and define the policies and legal authorities necessary for the Pentagon to operate in the cyberspace domain, and saying that that obligation has not yet nearly been met. Now, there have been attempts at making those abstract goals for the White House paper concrete, but not noticeably successful ones. In 2012, there were attempts to expand existing legislation that criminalizes computer hacking, so as to give the federal government the lead in setting standards for protecting sectors of our infrastructure, not by legislation, but rather by adaptive regulation, to try to strike a balance between security demands and privacy concerns by providing for information sharing between the federal government and the private sector, with liability protection for those who do share information, and to increase penalties for violation. All of that, very ambitious, went down in flames under fire from both the right and the left. Indeed, it went down twice in the Senate. In the private sector, the lawyers who make a living from existing laws and from successfully extending those laws to frontiers for which they may or may not be suited have been busily at work. Cases filed in the wake of data penetrations have established that if a company is arguably negligent in its data security policies and a plaintiff suffered either actual damages as a result of a breach, whether, for example, as a result of identity theft, or damages when there is a credible reason to fear that there will be a identity theft, the plaintiff has a claim. When the issue of impact can be proved on a class-wide basis without the need for individual fact inquiries, then data breach cases can be maintained as class actions. So far as the one comforting ruling in this area is that so long as somebody has simply been put in fear by the prospect of a breach and either can't prove negligence clearly or show imminent damage, they can't yet make a case. But hold on, the lawyers are coming. Just as an aside, there are those who think that the Supreme Court decision recently in Clapper versus Amnesty International, which held that fear of prosecution for material support of a terrorist organization cannot confer standing to sue, somehow raises the bar even further in data breach cases. I don't read that case that way. I read it as unique to the national security area, and I think it provides very little comfort for companies that think it's going to be difficult to sue over fear of data breaches. We're notably further along now than we were 2 years ago when the leadership of the Senate, are we notably further along now than we were 2 years ago when the leadership of the Senate Armed Services Committee figuratively stamped their busted rounds on the sidewalk and demanded that the Defense Secretary issue a clear statement of policies and legal authorities. Of course, we're 2 years further along, and events have a way of not stopping. Whether we have policies in place to meet them or not is another question. The Chinese, as we heard, are continuing to engage not only in economic but also in propaganda and even military warfare over the internet. They've hacked into computers not only of private industrial corporations in search of information useful to them economically, but also into the computers of journalists at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, in search of where those publishers and others are getting their information about China and what that information is, and into the computers of the Pentagon, which they bombard by the millions of times each day. Recently, as you heard, a company called Mandiant issued a detailed report, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, that identifies a particular unit within the People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398, located near Shanghai, as an advanced persistent threat of the highest order, APT-1, and describes its prolific conduct from servers in 13 countries that's managed to compromise more than 140 organizations and shown the ability to steal dozens of organizations simultaneously and in a coordinated way. For those who haven't seen it, I recommend the report. Don't read it before you go to sleep. We've also seen our own government, remarkably, perhaps improvidently, take at least partial credit for introducing a computer virus into the uranium enrichment facilities of Iran, with the result that centrifuges spun out of control and destroyed themselves, even as their computer monitors continued to show that the centrifuges were operating normally. Unfortunately, simultaneously, we issued a statement saying that if a foreign power acted in that fashion in the United States so as to cause physical damage, we would reserve the right to respond with kinetic force. Talk about a disjointed message. We've also disclosed recently that the Defense Department will add 4,000 people to Cyber Command, which, until that cohort arrives, is fewer than 1,000. And that that unit, Cyber Command, will pick up a national defense mission to protect critical infrastructure by disabling would-be aggressors. And there is as well a report that the administration has decided that it has the right to strike first when it perceives what it believes is an imminent danger of serious cyber attack in this country. Now, I should say I welcome both of those steps. As to the first, I can recall a meeting with General Alexander, who directed Cyber Command in 2008, when he said that his mandate ran to the .mil network and perhaps to the .gov segments of the internet, and that when he saw a threat to the .com portion, he had no authority whatsoever other than to look at the screen and say, ooh, that's going to be a bad one. It even got to the point where some commentators were suggesting that the government create a secure, closed internet for those agencies and functions that have national security ramifications, sort of an internet with side rails like a hospital did, and leave the rest of the Facebook and Twitter enthusiasts. I think the impracticality of separating military and governmental on the one hand from civilian on the other has become apparent, and that proposal is mercifully dead. As I said, the administration's more forward-leaning view on how it has to deal with cyber threats is, at least to me, a welcome change. But even as we applaud it, we should be aware of the danger, as was pointed out by General Hayden in an enormously perceptive article. We are backing into a situation not unlike where we stand in some ways in a war on terror. Just the same way we keep getting wrapped around the axle and try to decide where and how to try terrorists, and are unwilling to take any newly captured ones to Guantanamo. We seem to be, and are torn between civilian wars and military commissions. Can't bring ourselves to develop a coherent strategy for capturing and interrogating. We seem to have had little hesitation in launching lethal drone strikes. We are much neater, and don't, which are of course much neater, and don't present the nasty problem of where or under what conditions to confine someone. We are doing very much the same thing in the cyber area. We're backing ourselves into a situation where the only strategy we seem to be willing to adopt is a strategy of retaliation, until I heard the prospect that Chairman Rogers raised of actual intelligent defense. The National Security Agency and Cyber Command, both headquartered at Fort Meade, certainly could contribute to the conversation. But having people run around in fright wigs conjuring images of Big Brother has tended to prevent that from happening. Our responses to cyber threats, whether those threats are realized in actual attacks or not, are going to be governed by the same general rules of engagement that apply to the use of conventional force. But in order to build a robust defensive system, we're going to have to do something very much like what Chairman Rogers was talking about, and I look forward to seeing his bill in market. Thanks very much.
Thank you, General. Now, Stuart Baker.
Right. I am the good news. That's what I'm here to deliver, believe it or not. Although apparently I can't get onto the system to open up the...
Because it was hacked.
Yeah. Here we go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about the good news here, because I think we are a little behind the times in thinking about some of these cyber problems. There is a revolution going on in attribution, and the Mandiant Report is a good example of that. And that revolution, properly understood, is going to change our policy options. And the question is whether we're going to seize the opportunity to use the policy options that we are being provided by the ability to attribute some of these attacks that we're beginning to discover. Now, this is from a larger presentation that I do about attack and defense that begins more or less, since every general in the Pentagon seems to be waiting for the lawyers to tell them what they can do before they come up with a cyber war strategy. I got a JD, I'll give you a strategy. And I get to the attack point, that's what everybody likes to hear about, and of course the next problem is, who are we going to attack? And then people start to, wring their hands and say, oh, but we don't know who's attacking us, it's so hard, it's so hard. It's not that hard. And that's what we have discovered. And as I said when I asked Chairman Rogers the question, we've discovered that not because the CIA has told us, not because NSA has told us, or DHS, but because brave people who got into command and control servers that were owned by the Chinese got in and looked around and told us what they found, and they found a hell of a lot. They found girlfriends' pictures, they found phone numbers with the and QQ addresses, and a whole bunch of stuff that allowed us to determine who was attacking us. And the reason for that is it is not possible to operate in cyberspace these days without leaving little digital bits of your DNA all over cyberspace. It's just like Pigpen. We've got this cloud of stuff falling off us whenever we walk around in cyberspace. And I should have said, this is going to be the Huffington Post version of cybersecurity. You get a little bit of fact, and you get a fair amount of opinion, and you get a strategic amount of cleavage. So I knew Director Woolsey would like that. The rest of you, I apologize in advance. So what are these digital bits? Here's one. So what this says, all right, I'm being censored here. What this says is, this was put up on a site of law enforcement agencies that had been hacked by Anonymous. And in leet speak, this says, you've been pwned by Warmer and cabin crew, love you bitches. And it's, the picture speaks for itself. It turns out that this was taken with an Apple iPhone. And unbeknownst to the guy who took it, it very helpfily included the geographic coordinates where it was taken. And the FBI said, went to this suburb of Sydney and, as they said, obtained a positive identification of the subject. I said, wow. So apparently the Secret Service is not the only law enforcement agency in this having a great time abroad. They then discovered that her boyfriend lived in Corpus Christi, Texas, and he is now serving a year in prison for his attack. And just to make this G-rated, he has married the subject of the photo. So it's like everybody, it's turned out well for everybody. So that's kind of an unclassified view of the world, but I've been trying to popularize Baker's law that sums up the attribution opportunity, which is our security sucks, but so does theirs. And that's what we need to do. They are no better at securing their communications and their data than we are, and we know we're bad at it. right? So let's start taking advantage of the fact that we can find out all kinds of stuff about the people who are attacking us. And so it creates this enormous set of options for policymakers. And I'll try to be quick about this. Many people know what Attribution 101 is. You've got all the people who've been compromised up on that top line. Then the command and control server, which tells them all what to do and receives all their reports about the information. Then headquarters takes that information from the command and control server and ultimately passes it on to some final customer who actually is going to use the information that that has been stolen. So if we can break down that set of information, if we can start penetrating each of those steps along the espionage trail, we can go from attribution to, it's not deterrence, it's retribution, come on. That's what we should be doing. And so we can expose and isolate nation states and show that they are engaged in activity that will embarrass the hell out of them. That's a great opportunity. We can impose sanctions on spies. We have an opportunity to actually say we are going to impose sanctions of the sort that actually the FinCEN talks about. Why not say we are designating you a specially designated national hacker? We already have specially designated nationals for blood diamond traders. I mean, really, that is not our most important national security problem. What you have here is a couple of people whose pictures were actually taken with their home PC cameras by counter hackers who were investigating the attack. We can identify these guys and impose sanctions on them individually. This is my favorite story here. One of the hackers actually had a blog. One of the hackers who did the United States government serious damage had a blog that he was running under a pseudonym in which he complained. He cited the Prison Break TV series, complained about how horrible his life was, how bored he was out in the suburbs, and how much he yearned to break free of the prison that his hacking unit had imposed on him. And I thought to myself, oh, wow, we could figure out who these guys are. They're so bored. We'll offer them $1 million and an S visa to come to the United States. The first one gets $1 million, the second one gets $100,000, the third one gets $10,000, everybody else gets indicted. Prison Break meets Prisoner's Dilemma. We could do it tomorrow if we had the nerve. We could deny visas to companies who are hiring these guys. We've seen Tencent, which has one of these things, actually hired one of the hackers who did the United States government agencies. Well, we should be saying, you know, if you want to come to the United States, do business here, and have visas to come here, you need to cooperate with our investigation. We aren't doing that, but we could. And then finally, to my mind, the ultimate goal of this is to find the guys who are actually stealing and using the data. You know, the PLA is not is not using most of the data. It's stealing. It's giving it to state-owned enterprises so that those state-owned enterprises can go out and do business in the West, where we can reach them and prosecute them if we can establish that they got the information that they used to outbid Exxon for a particular oil tract or otherwise to steal data, to steal designs. If we can find that information inside their crappy, unsecure networks to prove that they actually stole this information or are benefiting from it, we can prosecute them. And that will change everybody's view about how much fun it is to engage in that activity. And so let me just, last point, what's the role for private companies? This is a brief summary of what I said to Chairman Rogers. This is how much help you're going to get from the police if somebody steals your bike. They will tell you how sorry they feel about it, and they will tell you what kind of lock you should buy next time for the next bike you own. That is the treatment we're getting from the FBI and the CIA when we go to them for help, because they don't have the ability to help, they don't have the resources to do the help. We need to engage the private sector, which will spend a lot of money to find out who's attacking us, to get access to the kinds of information that's necessary to bring a criminal action against the people who are attacking us. That's what we need. Instead, what we're getting, and I think even from Chairman Rogers, is a classic government response. We can't actually help you with your criminal problem, but we can make sure that you can't defend yourself. That can't be the right answer, and we've got to find a new approach that drags in the capabilities of the private sector as well as the government resources that we need. Thanks.
Are you up here as well, Mr. Kibitsky?
That's a good slide. There you go. It seems like there's pretty good light coming up here. Stuart Baker's presentation is absolutely fantastic. It's the right direction of where we have to go. My topic is talking about the opposite of active defense, passive defense, and why that's no longer working. And I want to talk about both diminishing and negative returns, and I want to suggest an alternative. And basically, what you're going to see over the last 15 years, I was with the FBI for 17 years, and what you're going to see is that basically the strategy of the United States and globally has been to work with the vulnerability mitigation side, like Department of Homeland Security, for example, and private sector, and has really strayed away with the folks who are going after the threat actors, the FBI, CIA, NSA, in conjunction with the private sector, right? And I want to kind of show you why what we're doing isn't working, why it will never work, why it doesn't work in the physical world, and how we should expect no different here. And it will take just a very brief introduction to risk as a qualitative discussion of risk, and then we're going to charge through. I think that the balance is really good, and it's going to lead back into this slide. So passive defense. When I say passive defense, I'm talking about looking at your vulnerabilities, looking about your defenses, how you mitigate the fact that you are penetrable, your systems are penetrable, someone can break in. Right? That's all we keep hearing. There's this focus on the victim. It's absolutely incredible how much cost today is borne by individuals and the private sector in trying to defend their security with little to no return on investment. I mean, it's incredible the amount of time, effort, opportunity cost that's going into a failed strategy, and how our response to that continues to be information sharing efforts to do more of it, right? And how we keep blaming the victim. So let's talk about this. Risk has 3 components to it. There's only 3 levers to all of risk: threat reduction, vulnerability reduction, and consequence reduction. That's it. There's a classic formula that doesn't do much quantitatively, but is very good qualitatively, and it's risk equals threat times vulnerability times consequence. This strategically is very helpful to recognize. It's multiplication, not because you get big numbers at the end, which justifies a big budget if you're the chief security officer. That is not the reason for it. It's because multiplication has a quality that addition doesn't. And that is, if you multiply something by 0, you zero out the formula. So it means that if you could get threat down to 0, it doesn't matter how big your vulnerabilities or consequences are, right? It doesn't matter. There's no risk. And that plays its way out. You bring all the vulnerabilities to 0. It makes no difference how big a threat or consequences there would be. Same thing with corporate consequences. And what you see in the physical world is that vulnerability mitigation makes really good sense against opportunistic threat actors. Meaning they don't care if they target you or they target someone else. So you lock your door, right? You don't keep the keys in the car. Because if someone wants to break into a house, they won't break into your house if you have a decent lock. If someone wants to steal a car, they might not steal your car if someone else has the keys in their car. But what's very interesting is, as soon as there's a targeted attack, meaning that it's not the same to the bad guy, it's not a crime of opportunity, they want you. They want your house, your place of business, your intellectual property, which is not fungible. You will find that in the real world, we move to threat deterrence. We put alarms up on houses and businesses. We put cameras up. And what those say to the bad guy is the following: we're not going to spend any more money on vulnerability mitigation, right? We're not going to try to make it that we have doors that you can't break into, windows that you can't open, that you can't smash through, right? That you can't dig a tunnel through the ground, that you can't rappel through the sky to get into my roof. Forget it all. We're going to concede this ground to you. You can break it. But now it's not about me anymore. Now it's about you. I'm going to put up an alarm now. I'm going to put up a camera. I'm going to detect who you are, and we are going after you now. It's threat deterrence. And when your monitoring company, if the alarm goes off at 3 in the morning, and the monitoring company calls you, they say, "Sir, ma'am, your front door was just broken into, but don't worry, we have the locksmith on the way." Now, how absurd, right? We've got the police on the way. In cybersecurity, that intrusion detection system is going off every single minute. And the response has been to send the locksmith. How absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't work. It will never work. It will never work against targeted attacks. And so we have none other than the National Institute of Standards and Technology that say to chief security officers, you will get so many alarms that you're just going to have to prioritize which ones even to look at. You could imagine a world, right, where if you had cameras and alarms and you call up the police and you say, well, there's one guy that came to my house, he had a chainsaw, the next guy had a rifle, the next guy had a battering ram, and they say, well, which one would you like me to look into? And that's if they're even talking to you at all, right? And this shift, right, so this notion in cyber that we've decided that it's about vulnerability mitigation and we've given up on threat deterrence is absolutely why we're in the state we're in. Sometimes you cannot build the defenses that are necessary. And when you hear the statements that everybody is being intruded upon, small, medium, large businesses, heck, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, RSA, right? If these guys can't keep the bad guys out, where does that leave most of our country, right? We've got dissident groups, newspapers, small and medium businesses, which, by the way, have most of the research and development in this country. They're all being broken into left and right. And for some reason, we keep telling them, you know what the government's role is going to be? To give you more information to better protect yourself. It will never work against targeted attacks. It can't work. Okay? And so they keep putting in more money without return on investment. That's called diminishing returns. What is negative returns? Negative returns is when you actually make the problem worse by your reaction. Okay? That's what we're doing here. Because every time we have our businesses spend more money on security against targeted attacks and raise the bar to this level, guess what the world resource, very capable, organized crime groups and nation states bring the threat to this level. And it's very inexpensive to create a better offense than a defense in this dynamic area. It would be similar to thinking about this building and how expensive it would be to create a 20-foot brick wall around this building. Think about how much money that would cost. And how cheap it would be for me to go to Home Depot or Lowe's, I don't have sponsorship yet, to buy a 30-foot ladder. That's what's happening every day. So we keep going to industry. I'm talking about regulation, right? And they're asking, what's the incentive for people to follow a framework of regulation? The incentive would be to show that it works. Right? The incentive is not tax incentives. The incentive is actually show that the Security Act will keep out persistent actors. But barring that, we're having all types of crazy discussions. Right? Sometimes you need to go after the threat, and that's where Stu Baker's point goes in. We have a resource in this country that's not being used for threat deterrence. It's called the private sector. And when you talk about the private sector doing anything other than vulnerability mitigation, people start getting anxious. They start talking about vigilantism. That's nonsense. Forget vigilantism, forget retribution and retaliation by the private sector. The private sector can do a lot hand in glove with the FBI, with the military, with the NSA, with the CIA, in ways that are quite stabilizing, that are not retribution. And we know what that looks like in the real world. Again, right? We know that if you're on an airplane and someone is charging the cockpit door, right, There are three ways you can respond to that. You could sit in your seat and do absolutely nothing. And you could have this conversation with yourself. You could say, my lawyer, I actually am not really afraid of that guy, but my lawyer said, if I tackle that guy, it's assault and battery. If I then hold him in place, it's a kidnapping, which is all true. So better not to act in that circumstance. Unless you think that this is just an example of, well, that's different, that's defensive life. Same thing is true if there were a purse snatcher that's running down the street and someone yelling, hey, stop that guy. He's got my purse, he's got my wallet. Same thing. You can see everyone just standing there. That's not civic responsibility. Then you have the opposite end of the continuum, where everyone says, hey, this is a good time to beat somebody up, right? And you run after the guy, you charge him, you get him, you kill him, right? That's it, and then you leave. Both those are wrong responses, right? The center is where you need to be, where people stabilize the situation because sometimes the private sector is the only one with the capability, resources, nimbleness, right? The fact that they are on scene more likely than the government, the fact that in our country, we don't have our government everywhere, they're on scene, right? And they can stabilize the incident. And so they hold the person in place, they return the property, and then they hand the guy over to law enforcement, right? We know that's what it's supposed to look like. But we haven't been able to bring that into this cybersecurity world. And until we realize that at the end of the day, when you're talking about advanced threats, it is about threat deterrence, okay? When you talk about advanced threats, putting more money into vulnerability mitigation is escalatory and has negative returns. And that the private sector in our country, especially when you think about transnational businesses, they have the resources, the capabilities, the global reach, but are lacking clear authority. And the government has clear authority and is lacking the resources, capability, and global reach. These have to work together. We've got to change this paradigm. A colleague of mine, Melissa Hathaway, recently writing in Georgetown International Journal, started with a quote from Darwin, which I thought was very important. Sometimes you have to go back to the basics. And everyone, if I were to say survival of the, you'll all fittest, right? That's what you're all going to fill it in, right? And we're all wrong. It's not the fittest that survive. It's not the strongest. It's not the wealthiest. It's not those who think they're the smartest. It's those who adapt the best. And we keep applying the old failed models and putting more and more money into them, thinking that somehow will make it better. We've got to change this paradigm. We've got to write this risk model. We've got to forget about adding more costs to the victim. We have to stop blaming the victims for their security. They're not to blame. The bad guys out there are to blame. And we've got to shift over to threat deterrence. So with that, I turn over to Rick Deerhall. Thank you.
Attorney General Mukasey said at the beginning of the panel that the Obama administration is basically down to threatening retaliation. That the Obama administration is threatening retaliation is our only response. I have to say, if only. And then just now, Mr. Trubisky said, forget about retaliation, forget about retribution. Wait, no, those are good. I don't want to forget about them. I don't mean to disagree with anyone on the panel. I just need to sort of broaden the range of options on the table. 2 years ago, the then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Cartwright, was testifying on this issue, and he said, well, if it's okay to attack me, and I'm not going to do anything other than improve my defenses every time you do attack me, it's very difficult to come up with a deterrent strategy. Right. So then after that, people made a fuss, and I think probably Congressman Roberts was one of them, and in the 2012 Defense Authorization Act, they put in this line. Congress affirms that the Department of Defense has the capability and upon direction by the President may conduct offensive operations in cyberspace to defend our nation, allies, and interests. And that was really good. And then the Senate said, wait, no, we can't just say that. We've got to add subject to the legal regimes that the Defense Department follows for kinetic capabilities, including the law of armed conflict. So now we're having this debate. The law of armed conflict, what does it allow? Most of the time when people say the law of armed conflict, they think, oh, the Geneva Conventions. oh, what the Red Cross says. Pretty much the Red Cross view of the law of armed conflict is it's how Switzerland would have fought the Second World War if it hadn't been fighting itself. Or they mean this treaty from the 1970s, Additional Protocol 1, which is how the Third World would like the West to fight if it is ever fighting them, which is don't hurt anyone. What people take to be the most fundamental principle, really I'm not making this up, is principle of distinction, which is when you do engage in armed conflict, you must only target military objects, and you must do nothing to hurt civilians or civilian objects, but otherwise known as like stuff. So I won't give a long presentation. I just want to remind you, if you think back, actually, unlike Switzerland, we in the United States who were fighting in the Second World War, as also in the First World War, we didn't actually fight it that way. It's in the First World War that we launched this phrase, economic warfare, which is stop anything from going in or out of their ports. And we did not think, well, that will only hurt the military. We very well understood that was squeezing the German economy. We did that deliberately. The term economic warfare arose in the First World War because this was a little more ambitious than previous blockades. It was not a totally new idea. And in fact, you see the earlier idea in the United States Constitution. It's totally forgotten. It ought to be remembered. I'm going to offer this up. There's a provision in Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the power to declare war, but then it also mentions and to grant letters of marque and reprisal. And they list that as something separate. You don't need to be at war. You can just have letters of marque and reprisal. And why letters of marque and reprisal? Because they have this historic experience. It really hurts your enemy if you hit him. And if you don't have the wherewithal to actually fight his army or even his navy, you just authorize private ship owners to go out and attack the commerce of your enemy. And who were the private ship owners who they authorized to do this? Well, some of them actually were people just engaged in commerce. Some of them had previously been pirates. But the point is, we gave them a license and said, go do it and you will hurt them. And the reason why they had this very much in mind in 1787 when they drafted the Constitution, they had done this during the American Revolution. We didn't have a navy. We still wanted to hit back at Britain. John Paul Jones, hero of the Navy, was basically raiding British commerce. He was mostly not fighting British warships. He was mostly attacking British commerce, which is a way of saying to the British, do you really want to continue this? Now, let me just say 2 quick things and I'll be done. I'm not saying everyone ought to hit anything and everything, but we should think about this more imaginatively. It is insane to allow the Swiss to tell us how do we fight our wars, and it's doubly insane to have the Swiss tell us how to fight cyber conflict, which it isn't even a war, and it's certainly not a war which Switzerland knows anything about. And we have a whole lot of people writing things about this. I regret to say some of them are not Swiss. It was mentioned earlier, Estonia freaked out when they had these series of cyber attacks a few years ago. So then they said, oh, we got to do something about this. So they cranked up. There's a NATO Center of Excellence in Tallinn. They recruited all these NATO experts on the law of war. They were all lawyers. Some of them were very serious people. I don't need to denigrate them, but they do what lawyers do, which is let's think of objections to doing anything. So they have produced a 200-page manual, Tallinn manual, and it takes basically the Red Cross view, which is, oh yeah, cyber weapons, yes, of course, but don't hurt anyone. Well, don't hurt any civilians. Don't hurt any civilian stuff. You shouldn't be viewing this as anything that attacks commerce. This, I think, really makes no sense. I want to mention 2 things. One, we still have the idea that in a real war we would use the Navy to impose blockades. That is in the U.S. Navy Commander's Handbook. We just don't follow the Red Cross view of the law of war when it comes to naval war. Is cyber more like we'll go out there and hurt stuff, do stuff? Or is it more like we send tanks into enemy territory and then say to enemy civilians, oh, sorry, but that's okay, we won't bother you. I'd say it's more like naval war. And so even what we now say about naval war should be applicable to this. And the second thing I say is we all should learn from history. Letters of marque and reprisal if you go back before the American Revolution, the original origin of it was in earlier times. Kings said, oh, they took your stuff, sorry. We don't really know what to do about that, and sorry, medieval England doesn't actually have really much of the navy, so you just compensate yourself. And by the way, if you can't find the person who took it, take it from someone else of the same country, and then they'll get the idea not to allow their people to do this. What a great tactic that is. We should be thinking about that. And I say, not anyone attacking at random, but people who come to the government and say, I have some idea who this is. We should have some procedure to authorize counterattacks. At the very least, to authorize things which would otherwise be illegal, which is hacking to find out details about exactly who did this and what were they doing. The pictures that you showed, that was all fabulous. It's a good thing those people haven't been prosecuted yet, because what they did was illegal, I believe, right? Okay.
Keep that argument.
Yeah, so we ought to have a way to authorize these things and say, you're authorized to do this kind of thing under these limits, and good luck to you, and if you enrich yourself, that's good, because people need incentives to fight and fight hard. And, I mean, this date in the Constitution is a worthwhile thing. I do want to mention my very last fact, which is a fun fact. NSA, I don't know what they're doing exactly, but Symantec, just one, computer security firm, has 10 times the annual budget of the NSA. And Symantec is a big company, but it's not the only company out there. There's vastly more resources, not just in sort of the private sector, but in the private cybersecurity sector. There are more now security guards, people hired to actual human beings with guns and stuff, than there are public police. There ought to be many more cybersecurity activists probing, checking, investigating that there are our government, because you can't rely on the government, as been so well said by my predecessors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you to all of our panelists. We have about 5 minutes left, which is plenty of time for a couple questions. So, lady in the front, please, you have the floor.
This administration is actually conducting the drone attacks, which also has civilians. So if we take the argument, then why not cyber? Do we have to call it war in order to be able to use cyber drones to attack other people?
Someone repeat the question.
The government has already said that it's going to be bound by the laws of war. So what we've done is faction the handcuffs ourselves. Do we have to? No, we don't have to. But if we're worried about opinion and liability, then what we're going to do is keep factioning the handcuffs.
Let me add one quick thing. I am in favor of having legal restraints on the conduct of war. I am not saying, oh, bah humbug, let's just go out and kill a lot of people. It's very important, I think, to observe humanitarian constraints, not only for the way this looks to the rest of the world, but I think it's demoralizing to our people to be responsible for $100. But you're totally missing the point of cyber if you say, well, we wouldn't allow infantry platoons to shoot at civilians, therefore we shouldn't have cyber attacks on civilian objects. Wait, that makes no sense. The whole point of cyber is you can impose a lot of cost without killing anyone. So we should be thinking about ways that we can get their attention, punish them, retaliate, but without killing people. That's wonderful. To think of this as if the main thing is not to hurt any civilian objects, you're totally missing the point of cyber. It's going into the Sistine Chapel and saying, wow, the tiles on the floor, they're really beautiful. Let me get a little closer and look more closely at the floor here. Look up!
In the back, right?
We've heard a lot of variety of cyber crimes, but I wondered if there's some kind of taxonomy or codification that says this is an irritation and this is cataclysmic.
Yeah, and I think that we actually heard that from Chairman Rogers. There's ordinary criminals and activists. There's well-organized criminals who come out of Eastern Europe and have quasi-governmental backing and protection. And then there are nation states who train the next generation of cyber criminals, as well as doing massive damage. But that's roughly the taxonomy of attackers that we see today.
What's the taxonomy of the attackers, but what he was asking about, I think, was the taxonomy of the impact. So the actual impact of the events, rather than characterization of the attack.
You know, I have...
So the vigilante will fit the crime.
Yeah.
And the problem is you can have non-state actors who can have equal effects for a fully funded state actor if they put their efforts in the right place.
So this is worth saying, particularly at this conference in response to this question. 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, we need to have universal jurisdiction to deal with people who commit extreme human rights offenses because that's so terrible. That's like piracy. Everyone used to say piracy, that's a universal offense. Anyone can go after pirates. And one of our former GMU professors here investigated this, and it turns out actually what they were concerned about with piracy was not that pirates were torturing people, not that they were abusing them, and not that they were, wearing bizarre costumes and frightening them. They were stealing. And they were really upset about the stealing. And people were convicted of piracy who had not hurt anyone but took their stuff. And therefore, it disrupted ocean commerce. I think when you have looting on a huge scale, it's silly to say, well, that's not really a provocation because it's just stealing. I mean, on a large enough scale, it has a very big impact. And I don't mean to say, oh, well, why don't you kill one or two people and then we won't mind, or then we'll get upset because you kill. I mean, it's worse to kill people, of course it is. But looting on a very large scale is a very serious provocation. And for us to shrug it off is basically like saying to pirates off the coast, off the Horn of Africa, as long as you don't hurt anyone, take whatever you want. That's nuts.
Yes, sir.
I think we're...
Actually, I'll give it to you next, sir. This gentleman here was ahead of you.
William Rammer, I'm concurrently with Equal Law Group and Larger Nexus. I want to thank you, Mr. Rapkin, about your idea of learners of mark. I always wondered why we didn't have privateers in this sector go forth and take your booty and strike. I have a colleague at a technology company locally who their company's been getting a lot of strikes, not only from some of the actors that we've noted here at PRC, but also from some of our supposed allies, France and Israel. And they're frankly at wit's end. They're maybe a potential client of mine. And I've been counseling them not to counterattack, but they're about ready to counterattack. Now, what do you guys propose? Because they're pressure finding, I got to protect my own territory here.
Microsoft last year went to court and they had a federal district judge to issue them, okay, go take down this botnet that you think is responsible for all this, and they did it. I think it's kind of difficult to say case by case, let's have a federal district judge decide this. So what I think would be perfectly sensible is something like these national security letters that the Justice Department gives to, Verizon or something, say, give us the data, you won't get in trouble, we promise, here's authorization.
But are we talking years before this happens, if this is happening now?
Oh, no, we gotta do this right away. I
Yeah.
mean, and the whole point of making it administrative is so that it could be done quickly. Right? They basically said, could you give this to us, and you can turn it around quickly.
Okay, could. Now, will it? That's the question, right?
So there are legal arguments. They're not perfectly strong if you're conservative, but that suggest that you can do more in defending and seeking to obtain back your own information. That's different from just sending people, exploding malware that will cause harm in their network. And I'm not sure I would recommend that because I think you'll just piss people off and won't actually do much. But the idea of gathering information on the people who are attacking you is enormously effective potentially. And the idea of doing that, it would be something that I would strongly recommend. You can get a lot of help from government agencies in pursuing and prosecuting people who have stolen information.
Why only,
I think we have time for Two more questions. So Stuart, do you want to finish that thought?
No, I'll stop and
Okay. We're over, but there are a couple of hands up, so I think we have time for two more. This gentleman and then, sir, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you. My short-term vision is off. Director?
You issue a letter of marque and reprisal while leading from behind.
Okay, the answer's in
All
I got a rhetorical question.
Sir.
Because we talked about asymmetric war here, and that's really what we're on, whether it's economic, whether it's military, whatever it is. Should we not be looking at what the armed forces role is, what the economic role should be? Should we not be looking to define a new way of how we're going to go to war? In other words, a new offensive that we're going to have. It's not going to be with putting naval ships necessarily in the South China Sea, U.S. naval ships. I'm talking about new rules for warfare, using cyber warfare, and the whole gamut of what we're looking at here, not just firing bullets.
And let's see, hear from our second questioner as well, and throw that open to the panel, please. Yes.
I commend the initiative and I'm very happy to know actually and to discuss this because I believe that it looks like really a new world and the job that all the governments of America started from the bad immigration policy of the Indians to accelerate it again. The tribalism were kind of cyber Indians here between the Indian tribes that couldn't organize themselves in a couple of centuries until we had the fathers of the Republic to make the proper balances between the institutions and what is vigilantism and what is the little border, and after that we have the international cooperation. What we have here is the beginning of this hope on this. Certainly we're a little bit better than the local Indians because we created, America created the cyberspace. It has a lot of knowledge, much more than anybody else on the planet. And we have the responsibility to organize the immigration policy in the world in a way to get the proper legal order that benefits American benefits the world. So I really commend this initiative, but that's why it is so interesting because you get Hamilton, the trade, the commerce, you get Jefferson, more traditional approach, and this is a long way that we're starting now, and I'm very happy.
Thank you. Ask our panelists for any reaction to those questions.
Actually, let me pick the last one on how we're pulling these together. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is a failure to monetize this issue. So we're in an area that a lot of people have criminal liability. That, I think, is a problem. Right? We've got to decriminalize a lot of the activities that the private sector do, but include a regime that would have civil responsibility. And in British rule, this does get back to how you engage your private sector in a meaningful way that allows for insurance, the insurance industry bonding civil liability to make sure that people aren't acting irresponsibly and doing it with the government. And the way, for citizens arrest, I think, for an example, the rule that came over from England was that in England, if a law enforcement officer arrested someone incorrectly, they could neither be criminally nor civilly prosecuted for that or sued. But if a civilian went ahead and arrested someone, did a citizen's arrest and got it wrong, they wouldn't be criminally responsible for that as long as it's good faith. But they might be sued if they caused any damage to that person. And those type of models, I think, are really where the economists, the technologists, the policymakers need to join forces. How to ensure that this is not a free-for-all, that there is rule of law, that there are proper handoffs, that it stabilizes rather than it accentuates or exacerbates these situations, and that civil liability and market insurance and monetization help make sure that there's accountability if things go wrong. I think that's possible. I think that we are far away from aligning these strategies together, but that's really where the results can come.
A brief comment. I gave a version of my talk with somewhat longer, a little bit more scholarly at Columbia also. And someone raised his hand and said in what I thought sounded like Indian accent, have you thought about cyber gorillas? Damn, I of course thought about that. I just thought I was trying to be scholarly. So he came down and talked to me. He worked for the Indian Ministry of Defense. They're thinking very hard about how to respond to hacking from China. I think we have a lot of potential allies around the world who are thinking about very similar concerns because they are, of course, also victimized. And we shouldn't be at all, think like, if we don't get a treaty right away, then it's hopeless, or we're just out there on our own. We have a lot of people who are interested in rethinking these things, and in some of them in surprising places. Not Switzerland. India is a big country, a lot of smart people.
Please join me in thanking the panel.